Welcome everyone in this new video tutorial about the multiplayer combat editor. In this video we're going to learn how to implement stat modifiers. So what are stat modifiers? They are basically just a way to dynamically modify the value of a stat at runtime. So for instance, if you have 200 health, you can add 100 health and you're going to have 300 health. So this is the basic example, but you have a lot of more complex examples. For instance, you can say you want to you equip a sword, and the sword gives you let's say 10% increased fire damage, and now all your skills and your character deals an additional 10% damage only when dealing damage using fire damage, obviously. So this is another example. And there are many other examples and many applications you can have for this feature. So there are two ways to use stat modifiers. The first one is by going into, for instance, your third-person character and open up our example character or your character. And then you can drag and drop your stat manager like this, and you can say, I want to add a stats modifier. But you see, this is under the system category, so you are not supposed to do that. But I'm talking about stat modifier, and there is that exact function with the right name. And you can call that, and it's all fine. You will be basically adding the modifier. But you see, there is a built-in system that handles all the modifier of the stats, and you'll have to handle that by yourself using the ID provided by the function. And we don't want to bother about this, so we are not going to take care of stats modifier through the stats manager. We are going to take care of the stat modifier using the modifier class. So we're going to open up our my base modifier we created, and the parent class of that blueprint is actually implementing a lot of functions managing stat modifiers, and we can use them to our advantage to avoid having to take care of adding, removing, and updating the stat manager, the stat modifier ourselves. So most of the time we are going to modify things, the stats, using the class modifier. So for instance, I was talking about the sword granting damage. Maybe you have your actor class, your item class, and maybe the item class is actually using the node add modifier on the guy who is currently carrying it, excuse me. And maybe you will be able to specify that you want to add my base modifier, which will actually modify fire damage, and this will actually grant your character a bonus. But we'll see how it works. For now, we're just going to create our own modifier. So for instance, if you right click anywhere, type in feature stats, you're going to have 6 events. So the 6 entries. The first 3 are just if you want to modify the base behavior of these functions, of the functions I provided us to handle the modifier, and we don't want to modify the behavior of the functions. We just want to call them and do whatever they are supposed to do. So the three functions below, that's what's interesting in that video. So we can add a stat modifier, we can turn off a regeneration, and we can update stat modifier. So we're going to take care of add stat modifier for now. Click that. So whenever we apply that modifier to an object, it's going to try to find its stat manager, and it's going to try to modify the value else of the stat manager to the amount we specified there in the modifier. How do we specify the amount there? We're going to drag a wire, make stat modifier, and it's telling us that it has a lot of things to we have several parameters to specify to tell how much and how it is supposed to modify the stat. So for instance, first thing it is asking is it a flat, a ratio, or an expired modifier? You never want to set expire. Expire is used by the systems of MCE to handle the modifiers. So you never want to specify this. You want to specify is it flat or is it ratio. Basically, flat will be incrementing the stats by the value you specify with an addition, with a plus, whereas if you specify a ratio, it's going to increment the stats by the amount you specify there. It's going to multiply the stats by the amount you specify there, plus 1. So for instance, if you want a 20% increase, you're going to specify 0.2 ratio else. It's going to increment the else by 0.2 ratio. And if you specify flat, it's going to increment by 20, for instance, 20 else. And then there is the modifier conditions. So what are they and how can you specify them? What are they is basically what are the gameplay tags that are able to use that modifier. So remember when we were dealing damage with our skills, we were actually using a bit mask. And we were saying our bit mask is actually a gameplay tag. And we were specifying gameplay tags, for instance, physical and fire. Well, this modifier can say it will only return true if you are asking for else for physical and fire else. So this is a bit strange talking about physical and fire else because you are never going to do this. But for instance, if you have your damage bonus stats and you are saying you want to increment the damage, for instance, this modifier is going to increment the physical and the fire damage ideal by 0.2% if you use the damage bonus stat in your character, if you implemented the damage bonus stat in your character. And then the last parameter is basically, is it a malus or a bonus? And in our case, we want to increment the else by 20 flats without any conditions. You can specify, you can drag a wire out of this and say no conditions, like this. And this is going to be a bonus. So for instance, if I'm hitting play, I'm going to have 40 else, whereas I previously had only 20. And that's because in our third-person character, we actually applied our modifier on begin play. So it basically added 20 else maximum to our character. And if I'm specifying 5, we're going to have 25 like this. But there is another, but you can only apply a stat modifier. You can apply any amount of modifier you want, but you can only apply one modifier per stat. So you can't add a modifier to that stat and then add another modifier to the same stat. You cannot, but you can update the modifier you previously had. And this is another feature. For example, if I right click, type in feature stats, you have a modifier called update stat modifier, which you can call like this. And then it's going to update the modifier, the value of the modifier you created to that value. So for instance, we were adding 5, but now we want to add 25. So I'm going to add 45 else. Like this. So this is another feature. And the last feature showcased by contained in the modifier class is the turn off regeneration modifier, which you can call to disable the regeneration of a stat. So for instance, if we turn off the regeneration else, if we switch team and hit the other guy, is not going to regenerate it else. Well, actually it is. Why it is? Because we are not applying that modifier, I suppose. If we go back to our status, example status, we are actually applying that, but we should not. So what's happening there? Our skill, our BP slice is actually applying a status, which is example status. If we go check our example status, the example status, what it is doing, it is actually applying a modifier to our targets. And we said the modifier was the modifier we were just tweaking. And we said whenever we deal damage with our skill, it is applying this and this for, I don't know if I remember, 5 seconds. It is applying the modifier for 5 seconds. So it is for 5 seconds, it is actually increasing the health of our targets and turning off its regeneration. So we actually just want to turn off its regeneration because it's strange because I think what was happening was we were eating the regeneration was properly turned off, but we were eating him and we were adding health to its maximum. And when the modifier was being removed, it was giving him health back. So we're going to check if our target is regenerating health, and it is not. And when the status goes off, it is regenerating health once again. Like this. So these are the main functions you can use to modify stats using the modifier class. So it's going to wrap up the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.